Closed doors, I'm a fool for you.
Good morning, everyone. So, for today's lesson, we will be handling or we will be discussing about exception handling. Okay, so part of this lecture, we'll be discussing what are Java exceptions and general exceptions. Okay, so let's get started. So, first of all, what is a Java exception? So, Java an exception is an event, usually some form of an error, which happens during the normal course of program execution. So to sum it up, exceptions are the errors that are being encountered by your programs when it is running. Okay, so now, what are exception handling? So, object-oriented technique to manage such errors that comprises a group of methods. So, now, with the use of object-oriented technique or OOP, you are now able to handle these errors. So, what happens is that with the help of exception handling, if an error has occurred, it will not halt or stop the program flow, but then you can actually do something or create a process on what the program will do if such error has been committed or occurred. Okay, so the exception handling mechanism is used in Java involves the following. Okay, so first it has identify exception condition perti pertinent to the application. Next, we have locating exception handlers to respond to possible conditions and monitor when such conditions occurred. So this is what happens when we are part of the things that what exception handling does. Okay, so when we say identifying exception condition pertinent to the application is that it will find whatever error or exception occurred during the runtime or while the program is running, and then it will now try to look what type of of exception handler it's going to use for that type of exception. Okay, so take note, there are different types of exception that we have. Okay, so we will be discussing that later on. So after identifying what uh, exception handler to be used, uh, it will now try to monitor if that type of error will be committed again. So this time around we will be discussing the different types of exception. Okay, so first we have the arithmetic exception. So as you all know, this is caused by math errors. Okay, so such as if you are trying to divide something by 0, so that will cause an arithmetic exception. Okay, so next we have array index out of bound exception caused by bad array index. Okay, so next we have array store exception caused when a program tries to store the wrong type of data in an array. So that is why when we create our array, we have to be very specific on what type of data type you're going to store on our database, because if it doesn't match, that's the time we're getting the array store exception. Okay, so next we have file not found exception. From the word file not found, this is actually caused by if an attempt to access a non-existent file. So usually this is being used for programs that are that that are currently using mga file store or use file handling. Okay, so there are some events wherein they use file handling to uh, work wherein files are being used as database for some certain programs. So we have the IO exception caused by general input-output failures. Okay. So next we have null pointer exception. So this is caused by referring to a null object. Okay. So next we have the number format exception caused when a conversion between strings and number fails. Okay, so as we all know, we are able to parse data types. So what happens here is if you try to parse a string into a different number format and it fails, that's the time number format exception is being executed. So next we also have the out of memory exception, because when there is not enough memory to allocate a new object. Okay, so this happens when you run out of computer memory. Okay, so that's why try to avoid opening a lot of applications when you're trying to work with your programs, so that you'll be able to avoid. Pero usually this is not really a very common type, since nowadays we have most of the computers already have a huge memory storage with allotted to them. So next we have security exception. This is actually caused by a security violation. Okay, and then we have a stack overflow exception. So this is when a program attempts to access a non-existent character position in a string. Okay, so next we have errors. So these are not exactly exceptions, but problems that occur beyond the user or programmer's control. So these are typically ignored by program codes because there cannot be done anything about it. So for example, if a stack overflow occurs and an error will be produced, so in addition to these errors are ignored during the program compilation. So as you can see, typically ignored by the program codes because there cannot be done anything about them. Okay. So next we have the check exception. So these are actually normal errors that occur during the execution of a program. So these include problems such as array bound errors and floating point exception. So these exceptions are usually handled by code blocks. Okay, so includes problems such as array and a floating point exception, usually handled by code blocks. So that one. So we also have an runtime exception. So uh, so these are exceptions that occur probably could have been avoided by the programmer. Okay, so this one the programmer has actually the full control about this error. So as opposed to check exception, runtime error are ignored at the time of compilation. Okay. So next we have method calls. So if a method constructor is declared to throw an exception, then calling that method or constructor may result in an exception of the declared class or subclass. So it is uh, completed. It is a method call. So if a method or constructor is declared to throw an exception, then calling that method or constructor may help result in an exception of the declared class or a subclass. So it is a compile time error for a method body to generate or throw, and not catch. So an exception that is declared to a throw class unless it is runtime. So this is an example of that one. Okay. So next we have runtime exception. So can occur even though the offending piece of code does not declare that it throws such an exception. So can be thrown by a language statement or a method call. So some of the errors that are being encountered here are the null pointer exception and the array index bound exception. So these exceptions can be thrown by a language statement or a method call. So the method executes a statement which throws an exception and the method does not itself handle it. So it is necessary for a method to be declared that is thrown such an exception. So for example, this one here. So as you can see, if you're going to run int a, and then or we created an array or for variable array for a, and then as you can see here below, the array immediately had a value of 100, which is not the same with what we declared. So that is an example of an array index out of bound exception. So that will immediately throw an exception. So user exception, so manually throws by programmer using the throw statement. So takes a single argument which must be an object that is a subclass of throwable. So example is throws new exception and then the problem. So that would be all for this lesson. Okay, so